For the first time in months, there's a noticeable shift in tone coming out of Kremlin. Russian President Vladimir Putin is now publicly suggesting that the war in Ukraine may be coming to an end, a statement that immediately triggered global speculation. Is this the beginning of serious peace negotiations, or simply another strategic message aimed at exhausted audiences at home and abroad? Do not forget to subscribe, like, and share for more updates. Thanks. The remarks came during Russia's scaled-down Victory Day events in Moscow, where Putin appeared far more restrained than in previous years. Gone were many of the grand military displays that once symbolized Russian confidence. Instead, observers saw a leader speaking less about total victory and more about eventual closure. And that alone is significant. For years, the Kremlin framed the war not just as a military operation, but as an existential struggle against the West. Russian state media repeatedly insisted Moscow would achieve all of its objectives, regardless of the cost. So when Putin suddenly says a conflict may be nearing its conclusion, the world pays attention. But here's the question keeping analysts awake tonight. Is Russia preparing for peace, or preparing the narrative for a frozen conflict? Because those are two very different things. The reality on the battlefield remains brutal. Ukraine still controls key territories Russia once expected to capture quickly. Russian advances have slowed dramatically, even though Moscow still occupies large portions of Ukrainian land. At the same time, Ukraine continues long-range drone operations deep inside Russian territory, proving the war remains highly active despite diplomatic rhetoric. That contradiction is exactly why Putin's comments matter. When leaders begin changing their language during prolonged wars, it often signals pressure behind the scenes. Military pressure, economic pressure, political pressure, or all three. Do not forget to subscribe, like, and share for more updates. Thanks. Russia's economy has adapted better than many Western analysts predicted, but the costs remain enormous. International sanctions, military spending, labor shortages, and years of attritional warfare have reshaped Russian society. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues receiving Western backing, even as debates grow louder in Europe and the United States about how long the current level of support can continue. Putin also hinted he could support broader European security negotiations and even floated the possibility of future meetings involving Ukraine's leadership after a final agreement is reached. That may sound diplomatic on the surface, but there's an important catch. The Kremlin still insists that negotiations must acknowledge what Russia calls the new territorial realities created by the war. Ukraine, on the other hand, continues rejecting any peace deal that permanently legitimizes Russian territorial gains. That gap remains massive, and history shows wars rarely end simply because one side says they should. In many ways, this conflict has become a war of endurance rather than rapid conquest. Both Moscow and Kiev appear determined to avoid looking weak. Both sides believe time could eventually work in their favor, and both continue preparing for the possibility that fighting may continue far longer than politicians publicly admit. There's another layer here people shouldn't ignore: public fatigue. After years of war, casualties, sanctions, inflation, destroyed cities, and global instability, audiences everywhere are emotionally exhausted. Governments know this. Leaders know this. That's why language matters more now than at almost any point since the invasion began. Even symbolic hints about the end can influence markets, diplomacy, military morale, and public opinion. But skepticism remains extremely high internationally, and especially online. Across geopolitical forums and public discussions, many people reacted cautiously to Putin's comments, arguing that Russia has repeatedly shifted narratives throughout the war. Others believe Moscow may simply be seeking a tactical pause rather than a permanent settlement. And honestly, that skepticism did not emerge from nowhere. Remember, this is a war where ceasefires have repeatedly collapsed, peace talks have stalled, and both sides accuse each other of operating in bad faith. Every diplomatic signal is instantly dissected for hidden motives. Still, even hardened critics acknowledge one uncomfortable truth. Wars eventually end through negotiation, exhaustion, stalemate, collapse, or some combination of all four. Do not forget to subscribe, like, and share for more updates. Thanks. The question now is whether the Russia-Ukraine war is truly approaching one of those turning points, or whether this is merely another chapter in a conflict that has already reshaped global politics for years. Because if Putin genuinely believes the war is nearing its conclusion, then the next few months could become some of the most consequential of the entire conflict. And if he doesn't, then the world may be witnessing something else entirely. The opening move in a new political strategy designed to redefine what victory looks like after years of devastating war.